Hello everyone. Welcome to the lecture on Vernacular Press Regulations in Colonial India. This lecture is a part of your paper on News and Society. The present lecture looks into the various mechanisms that were used by the colonial regime in order to control the freedom of expression of vernacular press in India. The lecture highlights the policy changes that were introduced by the British regime in order to curb the activities of the Indian press. Further, it looks like how native Indian press played an instrumental role in disseminating the anti-colonial attitude amongst the Indian people all over the subcontinent. Vernacular press regulations and the state of vernacular press in India is what we are going to study. The advent of vernacular press in India brought about a major transformation in terms of dissemination of information. Vernacular press, as agents of dispersing information, brought about mass awareness about the atrocities of the British regime amidst the Indian population. The Indian vernacular press caused concern and uneasiness to the government and acquired a reputation of disseminating seditious content the same way it did before the Great Rebellion of 1857. Increasing political consciousness of the people increased the apprehensions once again in the minds of British towards the vernacular press. Indian press was a multilingual press unlike its British and French counterparts. At the time of advent of press in India, most of the newspapers were in English, but later, Indian language papers grew rapidly. In the initial phase of press policy, there was an underlying unity in the policies and common conditions of law for both English language and vernacular language newspapers. They subsequently led to economic unity along with commonness in development of newspapers. Content of these newspapers was a major concern of the British government, especially of the vernacular language newspapers, as Indians generally published seditious content against the British government and owned most of the vernacular language press. Moreover, regulations about infrastructure of the press, that is both Indian and Anglo-Indian, was an indirect way of regulating the content in the newspapers in both the Indian and English languages. However, before the introduction of Vernacular Press Act, Adams regulations were imposed which were uniform for both the Indian-owned press and the English-owned press. However, in terms of practice, it was discriminatory towards the Indian vernacular press. There were a higher number of cases of cancellations of licenses and warnings to the Indian-owned newspapers. The Anglo-Indian newspapers, on the other hand, were given relaxation and additional provisions because of their pro-British attitude. Indian newspapers mostly criticized the policies of the government and talked about social reforms and policies. As a result, they were largely the targets of the colonial regime. With strict ban on the newspaper run by companies' employees by court of directors, the nature of ownership was only of two kinds, that is Indian-owned or vernacular newspaper and English-owned newspapers. The Adams regulations were seen as the precursor to Vernacular Press Act. Natarajan quoted that H.T. Prinsep and Lieutenant Colonel Morrison were of the opinion that excess of liberty to the press would create a problem in the long run for the colonial empire in India. Prinsep stated that, and I quote, "I do not contemplate entirely without apprehension the encouragement of the growth of the native press, which, judging from the spirit of discontent produced by our first experiments in the work of education, threatens to be hostile. He added, and I quote, "I dread that in its consequences, the native press may be subversive of good order and discipline, but the experiment has been commenced of leaving this press free, and we have therefore now only the chance of endeavoring to influence it and to give it a proper direction, or of abiding the result, leaving it to pursue its own course, in the confidence that we shall be strong enough to cope with it when we see danger," is the point. Morrison also expressed apprehension at allowing freedom to the native press. He suggested the appointment of a responsible officer to watch the operations of the Indian language press, and urged it should be made clear to all printers and publishers that government had the power of putting a stop forthwith to the operations of any press which in its publications indulged in sedition or in discussion dangerous to public tranquility. During the first 2 decades of the 19th century, there were differences in the opinions of the government officials related to the clear policies for the press both in London and in India. As a result, regulations on press were in imbalance. Lord Wellesley adopted a hard attitude towards press in the early decades of 19th century, while Lord Hastings was relatively kind towards them. This sort of warm and cold attitude continued towards the press. Yet there was a clear difference in terms of treatment of the vernacular press, which was different from that of the Anglo-Indian press. And the reason was clear. Anglo-Indian press acquired a supportive attitude towards imperial states' public policies, whereas vernacular press deeply criticized the public policies of the British regime in India. After 1957 mutiny, more intense and subversive policies were imposed on vernacular press. It was so as the colonial regime felt that vernacular press in India was instrumental in instigating the 1857 revolt against the empire. The period after 1857 till 1905 was a period which was understood as a foreground for a big battle against imperial state. The partition of Bengal was a painful historic event in the Indian struggle for freedom and for press as a powerful media. Lord Curzon's anti-Indian policies intensified the agitation. Indian nationalist movements became more intensive in their mission to root out the British Empire from India. The oppressive legislation and other repressive measures fueled agitation. It was later followed by the introduction of gagging policies to curb the press freedom in India. In 1876, Lord Lytton became the Viceroy. He conducted an inquiry about Indian-owned press and invited opinions on improving relations between the government and the Indian press. Robert Knight, the founder of the Statesman, was of view that the attitude of press could directly be derived from the attitude of government towards press. Government never showed sympathy and never consulted people belonging to press before taking any decision. Lytton suggested to set up Press Bureau, where an appointed director would perform the job of informing about the anti-colonial writings of the press. In the following year, the Vernacular Press Bill was introduced in the Governor General's Council and passed as an Act 9 of 1878. Briefly, its objectives were to place newspapers published in the languages of India under better control and to furnish the government with more effective means than provided by the existing laws to punish and repress seditious writings done to produce dissatisfaction towards the government in the minds of the ignorant population. It was also claimed to be intended to prevent unscrupulous writers from using their papers as a means of intimidation and extortion. The Vernacular Press Act of 1878 was one of the most prominent press regulations at that time. It was imposed because gradually, over a period of time, the vernacular newspapers in India started to become a nuisance for the British regime. For instance, Nil Darpan, a Bengali drama on the indigo cultivation, was published in 1861. It was a highly controversial piece of information. The Hindu Patriot was founded in 1853 and was considered as a terror of bureaucracy as well as to the white colonists in Bengal. The Bengali was founded in 1868 by Girish Chandra Ghosh, who fearlessly published his views on public grievances. The most striking feature of the Indian press was the diversity of language. The knowledge of English was only restricted to educated and urban community in India. Vernacular newspapers were published in every region in different languages. Growing political consciousness was one of the major reasons behind the growth of the vernacular newspaper in every district and village of India. The newspapers had readership on the basis of the name of the person who published the article. The government did not aid and support vernacular newspapers, while major advertisement revenue from the government went to the Anglo-Indian newspapers. Serious objections were raised against the Vernacular Press Act as it discriminated between the Anglo-Indian press and the vernacular press. This act was also called the Gagging Act. Under this act, once the license to run a press got revoked, it could not be reapplied, and this meant shutting down of the Indian press. Sir Ashley justified this unjust act by saying that he did not allude to personal attacks for personal abuse, falsehoods, scurrility, and exaggeration could be left to the courts, but the measure was necessary to deal with license, amounting to sedition. The distinction between English language newspapers and Indian language newspapers was justified because the English language newspapers were written by a class of writers for the class of readers whose education and interests would make them naturally intolerant to sedition. The act, however, was not able to bear the strong agitation of the people in 1880. Some improvements were made in this act, and finally it got repealed on December 7, 1881. On December 1903, the colonial government sought to amend the Indian Official Secrets Act of 1889 with the object of placing civil matters on a level with the naval and military. The Anglo-Indian press was one with the Indian press in its opposition to this measure, but the cleavage between the two sections of the press became more marked than ever before during the Swadeshi movement of 1905 to 1908. If any newspaper was found inciting offences like crimes of murder or any act of violence, that this act would put an end to the existence of the very newspaper. Even the police was empowered to attack the printing press and issue warrants before the order was made absolute. The government also authorized to cancel the declaration of the printer or publisher of the newspaper. A similar provision existed in the Vernacular Press Act 9 of 1878 and in the Indian Press Emergency Powers Act of 1931. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi launched his civil disobedience movement. The government had promulgated several ordinances to arm the authorities with powers to deal with what they considered intimidation and unlawful instigation. The colonial government gave full authority to officials to take stringent actions against any individual or press involved in covering and disseminating information about the movement. They feared that the vernacular press would add fuel to fire and would instigate the public against the colonial regime. The Indian press came under severe attack by the British forces. Even in 1931, while constitutional discussions and roundtable conferences were taking place in London, the government decided to deal with the situation in Bengal by introducing a new press bill to check the publication of matter exciting to or encouraging murder or violence. The Indian Press Emergency Powers Act 1931 was the result of this, which tried to keep a check on the great vernacular press in India. The Indian Press Emergency Powers Act of 1931 was aimed to better control the freedom of the press. The Indian Press Act revived the provision of the Press Act of 1910. It gave sweeping powers to the provincial government to suppress the propaganda for the civil disobedience movement. It sought to punish the words, signs, or visible representations which would incite or encourage the commission of any offense or murder or any cognizable offense. These cognizable offenses included violence or directly or indirectly expressing approval or admiration of any such offense. According to the Act, any person, real or fictitious, who had committed or alleged or represented to have committed the offense would be punished. In 1932, the Press Act of 1931 was amplified in the form of Criminal Amendment Act of 1932. Section 4 was made very comprehensive and expanded to include all possible activities calculated to undermine the government's authority. Any person who had access to printing and a printing press was regularly required to make a declaration under Section 4 of the Press Registration Act. A certain amount of security amount was also required to be submitted to the magistrate. The initial amount set was Rs 3,000, which was deposited in respect of any printing press for a period of 3 months from the date of declaration. As a result, what could be observed was the fact that despite the attempts of the British regime to gag the vernacular press, the voice of anti-imperialist movements grew in leaps and bounds as anti-colonial national movement gained strength. And now let us conclude. Let us now sum up what we have learnt in this lecture. It is hoped that after listening to this lecture, the students will have a clear understanding of the policy debates which targeted the freedom of vernacular press and how these policies operationalized in India. In addition to that, the students would have also developed a clarity as how the vernacular press played an important part in developing the anti-colonial feeling in India. What emerges from our discussion here is that the colonial government, learning through its interactions with the native and English press, developed and modified laws and regulations in order to avoid or postpone the fomenting of a national political consciousness in India. Sometimes these regulations were draconian in nature and unfair towards the vernacular press. Despite these attempts at curbing the freedom of vernacular press, the latter did play an important role in the struggle for independence beginning from the 19th century. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture and refer to the extended reading list for further study into the subject. Please do attempt all the questions given in the end.